In this video, we will look through examples in relation to dominance for matrices. So remembering that dominance is another application of a communication matrix. It means that we are setting up a binary matrix showing the relationship between two locations. In this case, those locations tend to be players or teams within a competition. And so what we're looking to see is one particular team or player more dominant than another, so has more wins over the others in the competition. And so useful to remember that when we're looking at those matrices, we are, as we set them up, reading in from the left and then up to the top, remembering that we would label our rows and columns corresponding to the players in the game. Something that is different is that we use what we call the row totals to determine overall dominance. And we'll have a look at that in this first example here. So example 1 has 4 teams playing each other in a round robin competition. And we have the results here where team A defeated B and D, team B defeated D, team C defeated A and B, and team D defeated C. We're asked firstly to construct a dominance matrix to display that information. So that means that we're wanting to show a one-step dominance matrix there. So our first step when we're setting up matrix D is to set up, in this case, we have 4 teams. So we're going to set up a 4 by 4 matrix, and we'll just label our rows and columns there. And then we're putting in the information as we see it. So if we think about just one row at a time, so if I'm concentrating just on row A here, then I'm looking at A's result. A didn't play itself, so we put a 0 in that position. A defeated B, so I represent that with a 1. And they defeated D, represent that with a 1. Because it's not stated here about defeating C, we assume that they lost to C, so we represent that with a 0. And then we move on to team B. So the only team that B defeated was D, so I'm going to put a 1 in that space there and 0s in the rest. So B lost to the other teams. C, team C defeated team A and team B, but lost to team D. And team D defeated team C, put a 1 there. Again, we can see our leading diagonal is all 0s. In a communication matrix, they would be referred to as redundant links. And here they are redundant as well because a team won't verse itself or won't have an outcome with itself. Sometimes you'll be given this information as a diagram as well, and it will be asked to create a diagram. And sometimes you might find that's useful when working your way through questions. But here we're just doing a matrix, and we're just going to use this matrix for the rest of our questions. And so part B is asking us to determine the one-step dominance, and is there a clear winner? So what we need to do here, this is where we would bring in those row totals. So our one-step dominance means that I'm going to add just the rows and create a column matrix. So if I add the values in the row for A, you can see they've had 2 wins. So we would put a 2 here in row 1, column 1. Team B had just the 1 win. So adding up across row B, we get a 1. Row C, we get 2 wins. And row D, 1 win as well. So is there a clear winner at this stage? We can say no, there is no clear winner, as we both have team A and team C on equal wins, equal amount of points. And so when we get this scenario, that's where we may go to look at, well, what are the 2-step dominances here? So much like in a communication matrix where we would consider 2 steps, what we're saying is, well, team A defeated team B. Team B defeated team D. So therefore we can say that A has a 2-step dominance over team D. And sometimes that might be easier to see from the diagram. So if we quickly draw that now, just so we can see a visual. And so that example of a having a two-step dominance over T can be seen really clearly from that diagram. But in terms of how we calculate that, we're going to go to our calculator and use this initial dominance matrix to find our total dominance. Okay, so much like we did with our communication matrix, we're just entering that dominance matrix into our calculator, so our 4x4 matrix, and entering those values as we have them written on the page. The next step is then to consider the two-step dominance. Okay, so our two-step dominance found in the same way, where we take our one step and then raise that to the power of 2 or square it, and that gives us our two-step dominances. The final component, if we want to find total dominance, is we're going to consider both the one step and the two step. So we're going to add those two values together, or those two matrices together, to get our total dominance there. And that allows us to then calculate row totals where we're taking into account both the one step and the two step dominances to hopefully see that now we can separate out a winner between Team A and Team C. Okay, so we've just transferred that information back onto the page here. And just a reminder that our total dominance is found by adding that one step and the two step dominance matrices together there. And so if we're asked then to use P to determine the overall finishing order, that's when we now want to consider our row totals. Okay, so we're looking at our row totals from the total dominance matrix, from matrix T. And so we can see here T in row A, we've got 4 in total, row B, 2, row C, we have 5, and row D, 3. And so now we can actually see that there is separation between the teams. We no longer have A and C both just on 2 wins when we take into account the other teams that they then have dominance over. And so that means here our best team has the highest value. So that means C would be our winning team. And so C would be in first place, followed by A in second place, then Team D in third place, and finally Team B in fourth place. Now we're taking a look at a couple of past VCAR questions. So this first one here is from the 2020 exam 1, and it's question 9. So it's quite late in the section, which means it's either going to be a challenging question or a time-consuming question, or a bit of both. In this case, this is one that's a little bit of both. So we have 5 competitors, Andy, Bree, Cleo, Della and Eddie, and they're participating in a darts tournament. Each competitor plays each of the other competitors only once, and the match results in either a winner or a loser. The matrix below shows the results of this darts tournament. So there are still 2 matches that need to be played, and we can see there that there is a gap in A and B. So that would be 1 match, and there is a gap here in C and D. A 1 in the matrix shows the competitor named in that row defeated the competitor named in the column. So that's just a reminder that we're reading in from the left and up. So that 1 there represents that A defeated Team D, or Andy defeated Della. The winner of the tournament is given as the competitor with the highest sum of their 1 and 2 step dominances. So here, that's a hint that we're going to need to consider both 1 and 2 step to work out who the winner is. Which player, by winning their remaining match, will ensure that they are ranked first by the sum of their 1 and 2 step dominances? So we need to consider, out of those 2 games left to play, if Team A wins, then regardless of what happens with the outcome of Team C versus D, or Cleo versus Della, will Andy be an overall winner? Or if Bree wins, regardless of the other outcomes, will Bree be the overall winner? And so on. So in this case, we have to actually consider 4 different possible outcomes. So we could have Andy win and Cleo win. we could have Andy and Della. We could have Bree and Cleo, or we could have Bree and Della. So we need to consider all 4 of those options, make sure that there is a clear winner, and if it happens that it's Andy, does it matter whether it's Cleo or Della wins the second match? Does that have an impact on the outcome? So in order to do this, we need a little bit of setup so that we can see what we're doing. And we're definitely going to be using our calculator to do this as well. So again, remember we need to consider both 1 and 2-step dominances. We can't just look at the 1 step. So that's why I'm thinking we need a little bit of a setup to help us out. Okay, so firstly here, what I've just mapped out are the 4 possible outcomes. And I've just picked up that initial dominance matrix and filled it in. And what we'll do is put that in our calculator so that we can find the 2-step and therefore the total dominance. So outcome 1, I'm thinking Andy and Cleo win. And so that means here in my matrix, I'm going to have Andy defeating Bree, which means Bree loses to Andy. And then in row C, Cleo defeating Della, which means Della loses to Cleo. And see what happens there. I've done that then for the next 4 possible, the next 3. So Andy and Della win, Bree and Cleo win, or Bree and Della win. And I'm going to go through each of those options and just see what happens. Do I have a clear winner? Is the first thing. And then what happens if it is Andy? What then happens in the next scenario? So let's go to our calculator now and consider the first one. Okay, so I've got the blank, or I guess the partially set up dominance matrix there. And we've said we're considering if Andy wins that first match, which means Bree loses, and if Cleo wins, which means Della loses. If that's our 1 step, and then we want to add that to the 2-step, so I need to square that, and that will give me my total dominance. So I can see there in Andy's row, we have a total of 5. In Bree, we've got a total of 7. In Cleo, we've got a total of 8. In Della, we've got 3. And in Eddie, we've got 5. So we'll note those down and then check the next option. Okay, so I've just transferred these across into a total dominance. So I can see there that Cleo is the winner in that scenario. So if Cleo wins her match, she is the winner of the overall tournament. But I want to check, does that still stay true if Bree wins the first match instead of Andy? So that's the next one that I'm going to check now. So I'll go back to my calculator and just adjust the outcome of that Andy versus Bree match and see what happens. Okay, so I've just copied down the 1 plus 2 step, but I still need to adjust this match between Andy and Bree. So if Andy loses but Bree wins, that will change those first 2 outcomes here. And then again, I need to adjust that in the second matrix so that I add on the 2-step dominance. And so add those together to get the total. And we can see now Andy has a total of 2. We see Bree has a total of 9. Cleo has a total of 7. Della has 4. And Eddie has 4. And so when we put that into our total dominance or our row totals, we can see that means now Bree is the winner of this one. So it didn't work that if Cleo wins her match, regardless of the other match, that she is the overall winner. But now we have an option where Bree may be the overall winner. So let's check what happens if Bree wins her match, but Della wins the match between Della and Cleo. Okay, so again here I've just copied down that previous one. So in this matrix here in the 1-step dominance, you've got Bree beating Andy, but now I'm going to row 3, column 4 and changing where Cleo defeats Della so that I make Della the winner there. And changing it again in the second matrix as well. So making that a 0, Della defeats Cleo, and checking the 2-step or the total of those dominants there. So when we look at that total matrix there, we can see Andy has a total number of wins of 3, Bree has 8, Cleo has 5, Della has 7, and Eddie has 5. Okay, so in our total matrix here with our row totals, we can see Bree is a clear winner. And so again, Bree, if she wins her match between Bree and Andy, regardless of what happens between Cleo and Della, Bree is our overall winner. Now we can double check by doing the 4th version there where Andy and Della are the winners. I've done that, and in that case, we end up with a row total where everyone has 6 points. So there actually isn't a winner. So we can be confident that our correct answer there is Bree. So as you can see, that is a question, being question 9 in that section for the exam that year, where it takes understanding of the concepts, but also it takes time. It is about checking multiple options. It's not a case of just being able to work out what one answer is. And so often you'll see that that is the case. With this next example, the last example that we'll look at now, we can see this is a VCAR 2017 paper. Again, a question from exam 1, and this is question 7. So again, towards the end of the section. This one, a badminton competition, is held between 4 players, Amanda, Ben, Carlos and Darius. In the competition, each player competes in one game with each of the other 3 players. The matrix S2 below, or S squared, is showing the 2-step dominances that each player has over the other players. So really important to note that this is your 2-step dominance here, not your single. From the matrix above, which one of the following events must have occurred during the competition? So did Ben beat Amanda? Did Ben beat Carlos? Did Carlos beat Amanda? Did Darius beat Amanda? Or did Darius beat Carlos? And so what we want to think about, if I look at the 2-step dominances here, if I just look at Amanda. So Amanda has a 2-step dominance over Ben, has 2 2-step dominances over Ben. So what that tells me, if I think of this in terms of a diagram, Amanda beat somebody who also beat Ben, because that gives us a 2-step. And she did this in 2 different ways. So there are 2 different pathways there. Now there are only 4 players in this tournament. So that means we know that these players had to be Carlos and Darius. So Amanda definitely beat Carlos and Amanda definitely beat Darius. Unfortunately though, they aren't options in our answers here. So let's think about the other 2-step dominance that Amanda has. So Amanda also has a 2-step dominance over Carlos, which means Amanda beats somebody who beat Carlos. Now, if they only play each other once, then the only other match left in this matrix here is either Carlos versus Darius and Amanda versus Ben. And so here, in order to get a 2-step that links Amanda to someone who beat Carlos, it has to be Darius beating Carlos, working across that diagram that way. Because if Amanda beat Ben, Ben lost to Carlos. We already know this from that first interpretation of A having 2-step dominances over B, Ben. And so we can see here from our options, Darius beat Carlos is one of our options there, option E. The other thing that we might have chosen to consider is where Darius has a 2-step over Ben. Okay, and so we want to make sure that the diagram that we have constructed or the picture we've created, the concept we've come up with, does still work in that case as well. And so if we check our diagram here, Darius beat Carlos who beat Ben. And so that gives us that two-step dominance of Darius over Ben, and that still works. Okay, so that leads us to fairly safely say that E is our correct answer there. And so sometimes it is more about drawing diagrams to help you see and visualize what's going on, but being really careful that you're picking up what information have you been given and not just assuming it's one thing. That'll be a really key component to be able to answer these more challenging questions. That's it for this section.